Welcome, wanderer, to Pillowsoft Fairytales. Wherever this gentle tale finds you beneath a quilt, beside a flickering candle, or in a quiet corner of the world, we are grateful for your company. If you wish, let the comments below become a map of sleepy stars. Leave a note of the place you are listening from, and together we will see how far a whispered story may roam. Now draw closer to the hush between heartbeats. Imagine a candle-lit desk, its polished grain warm beneath a poised quill. A single drop of ink gathers, dark and expectant, before surrendering to parchment. The tip glides, slow as moondrift, scripting the first line of a chronicle that has waited through countless evenings to be told. The page feels fast, the ink feels certain, and the hush of the room is the hush of possibility itself. In that soft silence we meet a merchant whose fortune, like a summer river, once coursed bright and untroubled. His house stood in a prosperous port town, its windows trimmed with pale shutters, its roof tiles catching dawn's gold. There was music in its halls, not the clamorous revelry of courts, but the hum of polished industry. Ledgers closing, sailcloth folding, timbers being caressed into masts by patient carpenters. Though ships bore his name to distant harbours, he wore his success with a quiet modesty, as though wealth were a shawl meant only to keep the evening chill away. He had 3 daughters, each the keeper of a different season of the soul. Clarisse, the eldest, moved with springtime assurance, her laughter quick to blossom. Yvette, born beneath midsummer constellations, favoured velvet gowns and mirrored corridors where she might practice a courtly curtsy. And then there was Belle, whose very gaze suggested the lingering warmth of autumn sun resting on ripe wheat. While her sisters delighted in ribboned invitations and whispered waltzes, Belle took her solace in pages that smelled of pressed violets and time-worn ink. From childhood she had listened to the meadow long before she learned to speak to people. When the merchant's carriage rolled out each morning, Belle slipped through the kitchen door, dangling a woven basket from her arm. She would wander beyond hedgerows, greeting the shy hum of bees, fingers brushing soft heads of clover. Foxglove spires bowed in the breeze as though recognizing her footfall, and she answered with a smile so gentle it might have been mistaken for sunlight. Evenings found her at the high window of the library tower, knees drawn beneath her chin, a book cradled like a melody. Candle flame danced over her features, sketching solitude into gold. Stories of other worlds set sail across her reverie, castles that breathed, forests stitched with silver rivers, friendships weighed in wonder rather than coin. Some volumes were so frequently revisited their bindings resembled the knuckles of an aging storyteller creased, beloved, unchanged in their devotion. The merchant observed all this with tender fascination. He returned from his voyages bearing items that pleased each daughter: silk for Clarisse, fine glass combs for Yvette. For Belle he brought parcels wrapped only in linen and anticipation, a slim book of mountain folklore, a packet of seeds rumoured to bloom at midnight, a brass magnifying lens so she might study dewdrops resting like crown jewels upon spiderwebs. In return, she gifted him garlands of wild rosemary to scent his study, and the soft, confiding clasp of her hand during twilight walks. Time, it seemed, moved with deliberate kindness. When autumn turned the port town into an orchestra of creaking docks and gull-calling skies, the merchant embarked on what was to be a final voyage before winter's hush, the cargo hold brimmed with spices, damask, and hope. His daughters waved from the jetty, ribbons fluttering like warm wishes on the wind. Belle felt an unaccountable stir, something quieter than worry yet louder than calm. But she pressed a smile between her palms and cast it, bright and brave, across the widening water. Days flowed by like the pages of a familiar tale, yet the expected letter did not arrive. Storms, rumoured to prowl the mid-sea lanes, had gathered suddenly, kneading cloud into dark peaks, smoothing the horizon into a single unwritten thought. Sailors who reached harbour spoke of thunder that rolled so low it seemed to scrape the seafloor, of masts groaning like ancient trees, of a moon extinguished by curtains of rain. The merchant's vessel, they whispered, had been caught in that sorrowful churn. When official word reached the town, it travelled with the delicate tread of a messenger who knows grief is a sleeping animal, best approach slowly. The ship was lost cargo, crew, and fortune surrendered to the deep. Only a small coffer, sealed and buoyant, had found its way ashore, returning a battered logbook and a single polished ring meant for Clarisse's upcoming birthday. Wealth that had once felt as steady as stone dissolved in a single, sighing tide. The merchant, Though spared by a twist of fate, his departure delayed by a sudden fever stood amid the wreckage of accounts and obligations, realizing fortune was less a fortress and more a mayfly's wing. Debts leaned against the grand house like ivy, patient and unrelenting. Clarisse and Yvette, shaken from satin-lined certainty, laid aside their ornaments without protest, and Belle, with practical serenity, gathered what comfort she could find in a garden now tinged with goodbye. There came a winter dawn when the family watched their townhouse door close behind them, keys surrendered to creditors who apologized with averted eyes. All that remained was a modest cottage, offered by a distant relative, a small stone dwelling at the forest's edge where trade winds rarely reached and opulence was measured in clean well water and honest bread. The carriage wheels turned over frost-sparkled lanes, bearing trunks not of brocade, but of blankets, tools, and the handful of books Belle insisted must accompany their breathing worlds. The journey felt surprisingly weightless. Fields lay winter-bare beneath a sky the color of pewter, and yet there was a quiet invitation in that wide emptiness, as though the land itself were making room for new beginnings. Clarisse pressed gloved fingers to the fogged carriage window, tracing invisible blossoms upon glass. Yvette, startled by the stillness between villages, rested her head on Belle's shoulder. No one spoke of what had been lost. Instead, they listened to the rhythmic clop of horses, letting sound stitch them into shared warmth. The forest greeted them without ceremony, trunks standing like ancient librarians who had seen triumph and ruin turn alike to dust. Snow peppered the path, yet in certain sheltered hollows green moss persisted, a promise whispered in colour. The cottage appeared almost shyly, half veiled by a tangle of fir and hawthorn. Its roof sagged where thatch had thinned, its shutters hung askew, but chimney stones waited stoic and ready for a new fire's first breath. Inside, the air smelled of disuse, cool and unassuming. Floorboards remembered other footsteps and offered a quiet creak of welcome. Clarisse discovered a cupboard stocked with humble earthenware. Yvette found a spindle abandoned beneath straw. Belle, brushing dust from a narrow window seat, imagined already the view come spring. How the forest would unfurl shades of emerald. How sun would bead along fern fronds like notes on a secret scale. Before dusk fully folded the sky, the merchant lit a small flame in the main hearth. Smoke curled upward, tentative, then sure, slipping through the chimney into the falling night. Around that fledgling glow, the family arranged themselves on crates and bundled cloaks. Shadows danced across their faces, gentle and brave. Belle opened one of her worn volumes, reading not aloud, but silently, so the cadence of familiar syllables might knit the hollowness into hope. Beyond the door, the forest drew its slow breath, a lullaby older than any house of stone or vault of gold. Owls turned their glassy eyes toward the cottage light, and somewhere deeper within, a brook continued its patient dialogue with stones, indifferent to fortunes made or lost. In this hushed communion of ember and snow, the merchant and his daughters eased into sleep's shelter, trusting that modest roofs can cradle mighty dreams. Soon dawn will slide silver between the shutters, and Belle will step out carrying a humble basket, eager to learn the language of these unfamiliar wildflowers. But that is a tenderness for another hour. For now, let the cottage rest in its clearing, let the quill lie beside the closing inkpot, and let the page await a new line. In the quiet curve of that waiting, Chapter 2 is already stirring, like pale light beneath horizon's hem, ready to follow Belle's first footsteps into the whispering wood. From the hush that settled with the evening star, gentle night had folded the valley in velvet shadow, and through its slow turning the sky lightened again, drawing Chapter 1 to a close and whispering silver. Now, as dawn unlaces the horizon, Chapter 2 begins, not with trumpet or drum, but with the simplest flutter of waking birds. Low mist, palaced pearl, in the still cool air, lingers among the thatched rooftops of Villeneuve. Chimneys breathe thin coils of smoke that drift upward and disappear, as though every kitchen exhaled a contented sigh before the day truly stirs. In a modest cottage set apart from the clustered lanes, Belle rises without hurry. The first thing she hears is the creak of floorboards beneath her bare feet. The second, the shy note of a wood thrush beyond the window, and the third, the faint echo of her own pulse, quietly promising that something wondrous might yet be waiting beyond fields she has not crossed. She presses her palm to the glass cooled by night and watches light pour softly over distant hills. The chores of morning welcome her like old, gentle friends. She lifts a wicker basket and steps into the herb-scented dawn, brushing against lavender, rosemary and mint that edge the doorstone. Dew gathers in crystalline beads on her hem, yet she does not mind the damp. It is proof that the world still renews itself, quietly, faithfully. With practiced grace she scatters grain for the hens, their muted clucks weaving through robin song. She fills a pail at the well, each rope-bound groan softened by distance, and waters the basil pots. Papa keeps near his workshop. The water darkens the soil in widening circles, and Belle studies the pattern the way a poet studies ink on a page, looking for secret meaning glimmering between ordinary lines. When the sun climbs a little higher and gilds the cobbles, voices begin to travel down the lane. The miller's wife remarking on the weather, the baker humming as he carts fresh loaves toward the square, a pair of youths arguing cheerfully about whose mare will run faster, come midsummer. Belle hears them all, but remains a slight step apart, half by choice, half by the gentle force that difference exerts. The villagers like her well enough. They smile, they nod, they sometimes shake their heads in fond confusion when they catch her reading while walking. Yet behind curtained windows and over steaming mugs, they wonder what will become of a girl who speaks to elders about constellations and to children about faraway seas. Suitors, meanwhile, approach as predictably as sunrise and leave almost as swiftly. They offer bouquets cut in careless haste, or compliments rehearsed in front of dusty mirrors, each convinced that the proper arrangement of words will tame Belle's boundless imagination. She thanks them kindly, listens politely, yet somewhere within she drifts to places their talk cannot follow. Toward lonely cliffs where waves boom like cathedral organs, toward silent libraries where forgotten maps unroll, shimmering with possibility. When a question comes, will she marry? Will she settle? She feels the gentle tremor of sadness, for they do not truly ask about her dreams. They ask whether her dreams can be stowed away, and so each hopeful bow, each polished boot, withdraws, puzzled, dusted by disappointment, still ignorant of the answer. By mid-morning Belle returns indoors, sets the cooled kettle on the stove, and retrieves a slim volume of poetry from the mantel. Yet as she settles, a flicker at the window presses pause on the verse. She notices the rosebush, the only one in their modest plot, leaning toward the light, its leaves shimmering with droplets. This bush began as a cutting Papa brought back from a chance journey seasons ago, and though it has offered only a handful of blossoms, Belle guards it as one might protect a whispered promise. She slips outside again, fingers the pruning shears, and kneels upon the damp earth. Her braid falls over her shoulder, while she trims spent petals, humming a song whose melody arrived unbidden from last night's dream. In that modest act her yearning crystallizes. Each thorn nick she avoids, each bud she coaxes, becomes a quiet declaration that life need not remain small. She remembers tales of gardeners who traveled to distant kingdoms in search of blue roses that bloomed beneath moonlight, of apothecaries who brewed courage from their petals. She imagines writing such tales herself. The village bell tolls 11, calm and rounded, and Belle closes her eyes, letting the vibration roll through her bones. The rustle of the leaves answers, and for an instant she believes she hears a note beneath the rustle, something like a sigh carried over miles. When she opens her eyes again, the hills stand unchanged, yet the air feels newly expectant, as though some unseen door has been unlatched. Afternoon passes in quiet industry. Papa, spectacles slipping down his nose, tunes a music box for a customer beyond the river, and Belle brings him tea scented with honey. They speak in companionable fragments about the tightness of a spring, the sweetness of early peaches, the line of a stanza she cannot quite shape. When conversation fades, they share an even deeper silence, one woven from mutual trust. Yet, outside that bubble, rumors move like summer flies. In the square, the butcher whispers that Belle's head is lost in clouds. The seamstress sighs that she wastes her best years. Gaston, the boastful hunter, proclaims he will claim her yet, though he cannot recall the color of her eyes. Their words slide off Belle like water, yet echo faintly at dusk. The echo follows her as the sky melts into apricot and doves settle on the chapel roof. She carries a woven chair to the threshold and reads aloud to the evening, letting syllables drift into the warmth like fireflies. Some children linger beyond the gate, entranced, but their mothers call them home. When the last child departs, twilight dims to blue, and Belle closes the book, smoothing its spine as gently as she once smoothed her mother's ribbons. She thinks of paths she has never walked, of conversations waiting just beyond the curve of the world. She thinks too of how a story's first breath often begins with one step taken in the dark, guided only by faith that the path will reveal itself between heartbeats. A wind rises after sunset, tracing cool fingers through orchard and field, bending the single rosebush so that it sways like a candle flame. Belle gathers her shawl and watches stars kindle above the western ridge. From that vantage she can just glimpse the broken silhouette of the old castle, jagged towers outlined against the moonlit clouds. Elders speak of curses and ghosts. Children dare each other to climb the overgrown road. Belle, for her part, has always regarded the ruins with respectful curiosity, sensing that ruined stone can shelter as many stories as any living town. Tonight the wind seems to carry a voice from that forgotten place, a drawn-out, echoing howl, neither wolf nor wind exactly, but something suspended between grief and yearning. The sound chills yet strangely beckons. Papa pauses at his workbench, listening, and the music box in his hand falls silent. The two exchange a glance, not fearful, yet undeniably alert. Then he smiles the way one does at thunderheard far away and returns to his task. But Belle remains at the doorway, gaze fixed on the distant battlements now swallowed by night. She wonders who or what might release such a forlorn call. The rosebush brushes her ankle like a timid question, and she answers by tucking a fallen petal into her pocket as though to carry a fragment of courage. Overhead, constellations brighten, pathways of light stitched across the heavens. She traces them in her mind, naming each star, and at the center of that inner map a turning point quietly draws nearer. Later, when lamps are doused and the cottage sleeps, the hush that first ushered in the day returns, now deeper for all it has gathered. Crickets pulse in measured harmony, counterpointed by the slow tick of Papa's repaired clocks. Belle lies awake upon her small bed beneath the eaves, hands folded over the petal, and lets her imagination drift outward, past rooftops, past orchards, to the road that winds toward the castle gate. She pictures ivy clinging to balustrades, windows shuttered against moonlight, corridors echoing with footfalls that have no owner. She does not yet know that the same wind which lifted her hair in the garden now circles crumbling turrets, nor that the lone howl was an invitation shaped by ancient magic. She knows only that her pulse quickens with the thought of leaving, and that longing, once awakened, seldom returns to slumber. The night presses gently on, and somewhere beyond the woods a lantern is being lit, preparing a path that shall soon ask for her steps. Its glow hums softly, promising morning and more. Evening had drifted into night, and the soft glow of Belle's candle still shone in the merchant's memory as he guided his tired mare along the winding road. Only hours earlier he had promised his children that he would return swiftly, bringing whatever small treasures remained aboard the vessel said to have survived the reefs. With their hopeful faces lingering like lanterns behind his eyelids, he pressed forward, trusting the early spring air and the pale silver of the waxing moon. The countryside lay hushed, a patchwork of fields resting beneath a veil of starlight, and the last notes of winter seemed at last to be loosening their cool hold on the earth. The previous chapter closed with Belle, carefully folding the mended silk kerchief that once belonged to her late mother. And now, as her father travelled, that very kerchief lay tucked close to his heart, a reminder of home. He carried no escort, only modest provisions, a sturdy cloak, and the promise he had whispered to his youngest daughter, "A single rose for you, Belle, if I can find one, even in the cold." Request had sounded simple, almost playful, yet it had settled into his mind like a vow etched in frost. For most of the night the path unfurled without hindrance, yet toward midnight a distant tremor of thunder rolled through the stillness. It sounded first like a muffled drum far beyond the hills, then gathered weight, swelling until even the mare's ears twitched. The merchant drew his cloak close, mindful of how swiftly spring skies could change. Above the bare branches, clouds were climbing, overlapping like dark wings, and in the hush between distant claps, he sensed a turning in the wind, a subtle spiraling coolness, as though unseen hands were stirring the night. Drops arrived sparsely at first, round and cold, flicking against his gloves. Then a shimmering sheet of rain suddenly swept across the road, erasing its borders and drowning the scent of budding grass beneath the sharp fragrance of storm-burst sky. Lightning flared, painting the hedges in brief ivory, and the mare shied to one side, hooves slipping on wet stone. He spoke to her calmly, voice low, yet the downpour thickened until speech felt useless against the drumbeat water. Seeking shelter, he guided her toward what appeared to be a narrow lane, half hidden by alder and ash, a route unfamiliar yet promising the cover of lower ground. The lane dipped sharply, and almost at once the roar of the storm faded to a muted hush. The merchant glanced back but could see little. The tempest still raged above the main road, while here a strange quiet held sway. Hedge and tree leaned inward, forming a kind of arbour, and the air, though damp, felt warmer, scented with moss and fern rather than sky-washed stone. Lightning shuddered overhead, yet its glare scarcely pierced the dense canopy. It seemed he had slipped into a concealed valley, cradled by the hills and sheltered by old woodland growth that drank the trank storm's fury before it could descend. Even so, rainwater streamed from his hat and cloak, and his horse trembled from toil and surprise. He searched for any sign of barn or cottage, where they might wait out the tempest. Twilight and tree shadow blurred together, and only when a sudden fork of lightning split the horizon did he glimpse, far ahead, the faintest amber glimmer something steady, too golden to be stray fire from the heavens. He urged the mare onward. The path widened and smoothed, not like a woodland track but like a road once grand, and now forgotten. Tall cypresses, groomed yet untended, lined either side, their dark elegance unspoiled by the storm. Presently, through the shifting curtain of rain, a wrought iron gate revealed itself, flung open as though expecting him. Beyond stretched gardens in half-shadow, terraces and archways, fountains stilled for the season, and at their heart a chateau, vast and symmetrical, each window glowing with steady lamplight, not a single shutter rattling as the wind tore at the world beyond the valley. The merchant dismounted beneath a stone arcade, adorned with climbing ivy. The door before him, carved of warm cedar, swung inward of its own accord, soundlessly, and a rush of perfumed air sleepy with hints of amber resin and drying herbs wrapped him in comfort. A grand hall lay within, lit by chandeliers of crystal that shimmered like quiet constellations. No servant appeared, no footfall met his ears, yet a fire burned in a marble hearth, and a table had been laid as though for a long-expected guest. Bread still steamed, cheese softened by the flame's gentle heat, and a silver pot exhaled curls of fragrant tea. He called out. Polite, though uncertain, but only the settling logs replied, draping it over a carved chair, and guided the mare to a covered stable he had noticed through a side arch. There, too, fodder and fresh water waited. Returning to the hall, he found garments of fine wool folded across a settle precisely his size. Everything appeared arranged for him with tender foresight, as though an invisible host had traced the arc of his journey and prepared solace at each step. Time moved quietly in that place. He changed, ate sparingly, and warmed his hands, marveling at how the storm outside felt like distant memory. He wondered whose generosity he enjoyed, and whether to linger felt wrong, yet weariness smoothed his misgivings. Still, Belle's request tugged at him. The simple rose, impossible at winter's edge, now seemed whimsical in such a house where wonder thrived. Perhaps in the gardens he had glimpsed some early bloom might brave the chill. Later, when rain had dwindled to a hush of droplets sliding from leaf to soil, the merchant left the hall and stepped onto the moonlit terrace. The sky above the valley shimmered clean and bright, every star returned. Silvery beams poured between drifting wisps, filling the garden with soft gradients of pearl and dove grey. The air smelled newly washed, alive with earth and the distant song of rivulets meeting hidden pools. He followed a flagstone path that curved around, trimmed hedges and sleeping statues, each figure half cloaked in moss, their marble shoulders gleaming faintly. Toward the heart of the grounds a smaller gate, wrought with swirling lattice, opened into a circular garden entirely enclosed by yew. Here, beneath glass panes fitted into tall iron ribs, a conservatory spread like a crystal pavilion. Moonshine slipped through translucent panels, bathing the interior in gentle light, and within this shelter roses climbed in tiered arches, their petals calm and crimson as though night itself had coaxed them open. He let out a quiet breath. To find roses blooming richly while the world beyond lay between seasons felt like poetic indulgence, an answer to Belle's wish shaped wholly from kindness. He approached the nearest stem and swept his fingers beneath a blossom, wary of thorns yet unafraid. Dew tipped each petal edge, cool and perfect, and the perfume was soft, no summer headiness, but a subtler fragrance reminiscent of memories half forgotten. With careful movement he plucked a single flower, thinking of Belle's gentle smile and the way she often paused to admire the smallest living thing. 2 petals drifted to the stone floor at his feet, making scarcely a sound. He regarded them, oddly moved, then reached inside his coat for a strip of cloth to wrap the stem. When he straightened, the air seemed to thicken, as if the garden itself had drawn breath. The moon, though bright, suddenly felt distant, and in the hush between heartbeats a voice unfurled. Not shouted, yet vast, textured like granite, resonant with something ancient. Who steals my roses, plucked from a place where no unbidden hand may wander? The words tremored through glass and bone alike. The merchant turned, and in the shifting sheen of moonlight, discerned a figure half hidden among shadows and vine. Broad of shoulder, taller than any man he had known, the being seemed woven from midnight and tawny gold. Eyes, gleaming topaz, fixed upon the single crimson bloom, cupped in the merchant's trembling hand. Instinct bade him step back, but pride and courtesy joined to steady his posture. He bowed, voice low with respect, and explained his journey, the storm, the shelter he had found offered without guard, and at last the request of his youngest child. Nothing else would I take. He finished, but this one rose, believing it might harm no soul. Silence lingered, thick as dusk, beneath the trees. Then the great figure advanced into full moonlight. Fur, dusky brown touched with umber, covered strong limbs, horns curled from a noble brow, yet in the severe lines of that face dwelled sorrow, deeper than the night. A heavy cloak hung from its shoulders, fastened by a silver clasp wrought in the likeness of intertwined thorns. "You speak of harmlessness," the beast murmured, and the sadness within the words weighed more than anger. "But the garden is my heart, and each rose is a heartbeat I preserve against loneliness. You pluck what is mine, and so remove a pulse from my keeping." The merchant lowered his gaze, remorse cresting within him, like the swell of storm water against a bridge. He knelt and placed the blossom upon a stone bench between them, its vivid scarlet stark against pale marble. "Then I return what I have taken," he said quietly. "Grant me leave, and I shall trouble this place no more." The beast's eyes glimmered, softer now. Petals once severed cannot rejoin. The wound remains. Payment is owed, and I know no coin sufficient save life for life, as old vows dictate. With measured grace the creature lifted the rose, contemplated it, then breathed upon the petals so they quivered like tiny sails. "Not your life," he continued, "but another you will send in your stead. One who comes willingly yet bound to remain should she so choose." The merchant's throat constricted. He thought of Belle, of her thoughtful gaze and her courage tempered by kindness, and terror flooded him, swift yet silent. "She is innocent," he managed. "Choose me instead." The beast shook his head once. "Innocence is no shield against fate. I have spoken. Return home. Within 3 days bring me the life you pledge, or your own shall ebb beneath these moonlit vines." The declaration sounded neither cruel nor merciless, merely final, like frost settling over a sage-please field. Moonlight traced pale paths across the merchant's trembling hands as the beast stepped back, swallowed again by the garden's layered shadows. Something in the air softened, as though the very roses sighed. An unseen door eased open behind the merchant, granting him passage to the hall. His garments of travel waited, dry and folded. His mare stood saddled, reins braided with a single white ribbon he had not placed. Before mounting, he glanced once more toward the hidden garden. He saw no shape, heard no breath, yet sensed a gaze lingering like the hush before dawn. He fastened the rose, still vivid, inside his satchel, for the beast had permitted him to keep it on one condition, that it serve as reminder of the bargain's weight. The valley released him as quietly as it had welcomed him. Clouds shredded across the sky, revealing the faintest blush of coming morning, and the road seemed shorter, as though time itself hurried him home. Yet his thoughts moved slowly, like heavy caravans crossing distant deserts laden, deliberate, resigned. Ahead lay Belle's laughter, the hearth's warmth, and the solace of familiar rooms. Yet behind, hidden among cypress and marble, waited a promise he dared not break, and a sorrowful beast whose roses pulsed like lonely stars. So the chapter settles, its echoes gentle but unforgotten, and the path toward choice unfurls, quiet as snow, beneath the growing light. A pale hush lingered over the eastern sky, the same pearl-tinted hush that had closed the previous evening when the rose, newly plucked, trembled in the merchant's uncertain grasp. Now that dawn seeped up behind the naked orchards, every rim of branch carried its own fragile corona of frost, and the merchant's horse seemed to exhale mist enough for two tired souls. With each slow hoof-step along the winding lane, memory replayed the velvet-voiced decree he had received. Inside the hidden castle, one life owed for the theft of a single crimson blossom. The farther he rode from those echoing halls, the more sharply remorse pressed against his chest, as though the thorny stem he had pocketed were growing inward instead of out. At last the familiar fields unrolled white tapestries, studded with brown stubble where summer wheat once swayed, and the cottage roof appeared, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. A single shutter creaked, nudged by the breeze, while within the window's lamplight fluttered like a heart unsure of its rhythm. The merchant dismounted, boots crunching on the drifted path, and paused to steady himself before the door he had opened 1,000 times without dread. On this morning, the iron latch felt heavier than ledges, heavier than years of voyages, heavier than the sea itself. Belle was the first to greet him. She had risen early to mend a frayed cloak, and the quiet hem-stitches stilled the moment her father stepped across the threshold. Snowflakes clung to his beard, melting in reluctant beads. Behind Belle, her two sisters hovered, their night shawls wrapped tight, eyes bright with relief that quickly shifted into puzzled concern. The merchant offered the rose as though it might speak for him, yet the bloom's scarlet petals seemed suddenly subdued in the small kitchen, their colour at odds with the ashen folds beneath his eyes. When at last words emerged, they tumbled out in muted fragments. A lost road, a storm, shelter granted, gratitude turned to disaster beneath a glass-roofed winter garden. He told of the hidden host whose face lay hidden behind a mane of shadow, of the sentence pronounced in a voice that filled corridors like distant thunder, of the single chance granted return home, bid farewell, then return to meet the price. The merchant's shoulders sagged as he finished, a man hollowed by fear not for himself but for the daughters who listened. The elder sisters recoiled, casting anxious glances toward the frosted panes as though the unseen lord might stride through the drifting ferns that framed the path. Yet Belle, standing closer, heard the quiet plea that threaded beneath her father's confession. She touched the rose, then the trembling hands that offered it, and understood that the flower had been plucked not for vanity but for love. No other gift from so perilous an errand would have carried such plain sincerity. Because of that small, earnest gesture, her father now stood at the brink of ruin. Evening drifted down sooner than anyone wished, filling the cottage with amber shadows. Belle withdrew to her room to ponder, fingers tracing patterns on the frosted glass. Across the fields the moon rose, paired into a thin scythe of silver. In the hush she weighed the bargain. One life, in exchange for her father's freedom. Yet some instinct, older than fear, whispered that the hidden lord might be more than he first appeared, that a fate so oddly spun might hold threads finer than judgment alone. And so when she descended the narrow stair, cheeks warmed by decision, her voice carried the ripeness of winter fruit. She would go in her father's stead. Protests swelled at once, her sisters with quavering voices, the merchant with broken words. But Belle's resolve was calm, not born of recklessness but of measured kindness. She reminded them that promises, once spoken, travel their own roads. Meeting them freely was better than waiting for them to arrive unbidden. At length the merchant, seeing the quiet light in her eyes, recognized the same steadfastness that had guided their family through misfortune before. Sorrowing though he was, he found no will to forbid her. Preparations were simple: grey wool, 2 plain dresses, a worn copy of Fables from Ancient Lands, and a miniature painting of her mother, its gilded edge dulled by years of touch. Belle also slipped into the pocket of her cloak a sprig of dried lavender gathered when the world still smelled of summer. For memory's sake. Outside, the horse a patient mare, the colour of moonlit bark, stamped softly as harness was buckled. Supper was taken by candlelight, root vegetable stew, whose steam curled like a last benediction. Silence fell more often than speech, every glance an acknowledgement of what dawn would bring. When the final spoon rested, Belle rose and moved to her father's side. In that quiet candle glow, father and daughter embraced, her head against the worn wool of his travelling coat, his hand over the ribbon binding her hair. Nothing was said of farewell, the hush itself conveyed it. Night deepened. One by one the candles were pinched, yet Belle remained awake. listening to the hush breathe through rafters. In the dark, she imagined the forest path winding like a pale ribbon, imagined also the looming silhouette of a castle whose foundations might be older than the first tale ever told. She wondered how many feet, in ages past, had traced the same snow-muffled tracks she soon would follow. Dawn came muffled by a quilt of cloud. Belle buckled her cloak, accepted a parcel of bread, cheese, and apples, and stepped into the thin light. Her sisters hovered on the threshold, shawls drawn tight. Tears glimmered in their eyes but did not fall. Instead they pressed small tokens into Belle's palms, a silver thimble, a ribbon of blue satin as symbols that a part of them would follow her. The merchant, stunned by equal parts grief and gratitude, placed the rose within Belle's satchel, its stem wrapped in damp moss to keep it living. He whispered that its colour would remind her of home when twilight wrapped the unfamiliar stones ahead. With a gentle click of tongue, Belle urged the mare forward, hooves sinking into powdery snow. The cottage receded, chimney smoke drifting like a prayer made visible. Wind played through bare boughs, shaking, glittering crystals that settled on Belle's hair like scattered stardust. Though winter sharpened every scent, the air within the forest carried a cedar sweetness she had not noticed before. As though unseen braziers burned fragrant wood in some hidden hole, the path curled, rose, and narrowed. Banks of snow lying folded like white wings on either side. Bare beeches lifted pale limbs against the grey sky, and evergreen pines crowded together, their needles catching flecks of snow that glowed in inward quiet, the rhythmic sway. The raid in inward quiet, the rhythmic sway of the saddle matching her heartbeat. From time to time she hummed low songs without words, music recalling summer streams and daisies, nodding beneath beechen shade. The mare's ears flicked, soothed. Presently the forest deepened, and with depth came oddities, patches of hoarfrost sculpted into tiny spirals, moss glowing faintly green even under snow. A distant echo as though water fell from a great height, though no river lay near. In one glade, a stag as white as untouched parchment watched Belle pass, breath plume curling over his antlers before he faded soundlessly into thicket. She felt neither fear nor boldness, only an expanding wonder, as though the very trees were turning pages of a story too ancient for voice. Midday light dimmed unnoticed beneath growing cloud. Snow began again, fine as sifted flour, drawn left and right by breezes weaving between trunks. Belle pulled her hood closer, yet cold did not bite. Instead the air felt charged with a subtle welcome, like the hush inside a cathedral before a lone chorister sings. Footprints of small animals patterned the snow with momentary calligraphy. Loops, dots, gentle dashes leading nowhere and everywhere at once. A turn in the path revealed an arch of intertwining branches sagging beneath icicles. As Belle passed under, the forest atmosphere altered, as though sound itself were muffled inside thicker shadows. She glimpsed half-buried paving stones, their surfaces engraved with curling vines and distant stars. Columns of yew and spruce bordered the way, standing sentinel. Something in their stance suggested memory rather than menace. Twilight approached without the flare of sunset, merely a softening of grey into deeper blue. Lantern light seemed to glow ahead, yet no lanterns hung, only clusters of winter fireflies, pale as falling ash, drifting high among the limbs and losing themselves against gathering dusk. Belle rode on, guided by faint shimmer. The mare's hoofbeats grew muted, as though stone now underlay the snow. Then, through a final veil of cedar boughs, the forest opened. Belle gasped, the sound no louder than a falling flake. Before her rose gates fashioned of wrought iron and starlight, so tall they rivaled the nearest treetops. Each bar was twined with metal roses, whose petals held traces of impossible bloom, silver tinged with midnight blue, copper flushed with sunrise pink. Snow lay upon the crossbars in delicate drifts, unbroken. Beyond the gates she glimpsed the forecourt, paved with black marble veined in pearl, and farther still the first tower slender, many-windowed, and rimmed in hoarfrost that glittered like sleepless constellations. No drawbridge lifted, no guards waited, only silence stood between Belle and the unknown realm. She dismounted, boots sinking to the ankle. Approaching, she slid off her glove and pressed a bare palm to the iron. It was not cold, instead warmth pulsed faintly, as though the gates themselves owned a beating heart, attuned to whoever sought entry. In that moment, Belle understood that the journey's outward miles were only an echo of a deeper passage, one that curved inward toward mystery. She closed her eyes and breathed the faint scent of snow mingled with unseen roses. Above, a single bell tolled soft, grave and distant, its note floating down like a silver thread. The gate stirred, hinges moving without protest, parting wide enough for rider and mare. No hand appeared to guide them, yet invitation shimmered in the widening space. Belle led the mare forward a step, pausing once to look back at the forest path, now evening blue under sparse starlight. Home lay far beyond those trees, yet she felt not severed but subtly connected, as though every footfall were being recorded by gentle eyes that wished her well. She gathered her cloak, straightened her shoulders, and entered the courtyard where snowflakes drifted in slow spirals, catching glints of light from high windows. The gates closed behind with a hush like pages settling. Within the encircling walls, lanterns flared one by one, stirred by no visible hand, casting soft halos upon statues wrapped in ivy's winter bones. A path of marble steps wound toward towering doors of polished oak carved with intertwined beasts and blossoms. Yet Belle did not climb them. Not yet. She stood at the courtyard's heart, head tipped back to study the immense facade. Somewhere within, the one called Beast waited, bound to bargain and destiny alike. Snow continued its downward drift, weaving a muffled quilt across hoofprint and bootprint together, uniting them in quiet pattern. Overhead, hidden strings of music seemed to brush the air, perhaps the wind, perhaps memory, perhaps the castle itself murmuring welcome. Belle's breath rose white, mingling with the swirl, momentarily forming shapes like wings before fading. She exhaled, slow as turning pages, and felt no trembling. Whatever awaited in those shadowed halls, she would meet it on her own terms, guided by the same steady mercy that had led her from the warm cottage hearth into the silvered dark. High above, a window brightened, spilling amber light across a balcony where frost rimmed every balustrade. The glow lingered, a mild promise rather than a command. Night settled fully, at last, the courtyard lamplit and dreamlike. Belle lifted the rose from her satchel, brushed a snowflake from its petals, and tucked it carefully into her cloak. The bloom's scarlet warmth, spared from winter's bite, seemed to pulse with silent courage. In a moment more she would guide the mare to the stables, mount the marble steps, and cross the threshold where echoes waited. But for now she remained motionless amid drifting flakes, breathing the hush, letting the wonder of the journey finish unfurling inside her, like a chapter reaching its last word. Beyond those open doors, corridors wound toward hidden libraries, candlelit dining halls, and encounters that would bend the shape of both hearts and seasons. Before such revelations, the quiet had its say, laying down a soft foundation on which tomorrow might build, and so snow kept falling, steady and soundless, as the castle held its breath. From the hush that followed Belle's first twilight glimpse of the castle's silent corridors, the evening drifted onward as gently as breath over a glass harp. Torches guttered behind crystal shades, their wavering light still tracing the parting shimmer of the rose-red sunset that had coloured the windows in the previous chapter. That tender stain now softened into muted mauves and dusky blues, and Belle, wrapped in borrowed velvet, allowed the subdued afterglow to guide her deeper inside, as though she walked through a dream already half remembered. The grand hall revealed itself by degrees, each measured pace broadening Belle's view the way a curtain glides to the side. Pillars of pale marble rose like forest trunks to a ceiling, vaulted so high that the shadows seemed to breathe. Between those pillars, carved balustrades caught what little light remained, producing faint opalescent flickers, quiet reminders that someone, once upon a time, had commanded artisans to lavish hours of patience upon every spiral and leaf. At the far end stood a hearth large enough to swallow the night, its embers banked but glowing, knitting a loose net of warmth that drifted outward in slow, almost musical pulses. And yet, despite the finery, the hall felt uninhabited, an ornate shell whose heartbeat had long ago fallen into a slumber. Belle's footsteps whispered across the parquet floor, the soft soles of her borrowed slippers clicking only when she forgot to tread lightly. Nobody answered her tentative greeting. She listened for human bustle clatter in dishes, distant laughter, but encountered instead a hush thick enough to shape itself around her, like a second cloak. A sudden scuff of claws broke the stillness, followed by the measured thump of weighty footfalls. Belle turned. In the archway opposite stood the beast, shoulders squared beneath a coat the colour of midnight water. His mane was weather-dark and uncombed, yet his eyes, for all their wild glint, carried a question rather than a challenge. He inclined his massive head in greeting, a gesture stiff with unfamiliar etiquette, and Belle, remembering the manners her father had always praised, responded with a shallow curtsy. Her pulse fluttered, a small bird against her ribs, but her voice, when it emerged, was calm, almost musical. "Good evening, sir." The beast's reply came out ragged, as though the syllables were stones he had to mine, from the back of his throat. "You are welcome." He shifted, awkward in his own grandeur, then motioned toward a long, glimmering table that until now had stood bare. Even as Belle's gaze travelled its length, curtains of air stirred, and forms half-seen glided into being. Candlesticks floating, platters hovering, crystal goblets drifting, as if borne by the gentlest current. Though no servants made themselves visible, their presence was unmistakable in every precise movement, every napkin folded with a grace surpassing ordinary hands. One by one, candles awakened. Their flames steadied in the still air, painting rings of honeyed light across silver lids and porcelains, so thin they almost trembled. Aromas soon followed, whispers of nutmeg, roasted chestnut, orchard fruits simmered in cinnamon wine, each scent unfurled like a ribbon, weaving comfort through the lingering apprehension. Belle's hunger, forgotten during her journey, rekindled, but stronger than appetite was her wonder at the unseen choreography turning emptiness into welcome. The beast rumbled a curt instruction toward the hovering platters, as though embarrassed by their obedience. When he drew out Belle's chair careful, despite the roughness of claw against wood, he kept his eyes lowered, resolving not to startle her further. She thanked him, and the simple courtesy fluttered through the cavernous room like a wren, alighting briefly upon a chandelier's crystal drops before settling inside the beast's chest. Warm and unfamiliar, conversation at first crawled. The beast, unpracticed in the smaller keys of speech, ventured remarks that emerged as brief, jagged bursts, while Belle answered in sentences she laboured to keep steady. Between them lay roasted pheasant, glazed with orchard honey, herb-flecked breads, and clear soup scattered with violet petals, yet both dallied over each bite, searching for a safe rhythm. Finally, Belle spoke of her father, his tinkering joys, the way he measured starlight inside brass tubes. Something in that description stirred the beast, and the tension across his brow eased, like ice cracking under dawn. Seeing that softening, Belle dared a question. "You must be accustomed to splendor," she said gently, "but do you dine alone every night?" The beast's answer arrived after a pause long enough for candle wax to pearl and fall. "Alone," he conceded, voice thick with a solitude that had grown gravel deep. He might have said more, yet chose instead to reach for something hidden within his coat. He withdrew a hand mirror, its frame of rose gold, twining about glass so clear it seemed to reflect more than light. He laid the mirror beside Belle's plate. "Look," he urged, the single word almost tender beneath its growl. When Belle lifted the glass, mist whirled across its surface, dissolving to reveal her father's workshop. There, in a halo of lamplight, her father bent over a sketch, spectacles sliding perilously down his nose, humming the sea chant he favoured when his inventions behaved. Each detail glistened with impossible accuracy. A watch spring-flecked with solder, a cup of half-cooled tea. Tears, unasked yet welcomed, brightened Belle's lashes. Gratitude warmed her cheeks, chasing away some of the amber fear that had settled in her belly. She lowered the mirror. "He is safe," she whispered, half to herself, half to the enormous figure opposite. "Thank you." The beast shrugged, uneasy under praise, but a shy glow threaded through his eyes. Belle attempted a smile, and in return he offered something like a nod, though the movement was so subtle it might have been only the flicker of candlelight. Strengthened by relief, she found courage for a promise. "I will dine with you every evening, and speak of whatever pleases you, books, weather, forgotten legends, so long as I may look upon my father each night and know he fares well." The beast's reply came softly, astonishing even himself with its gentleness. Yes, nothing more. Yet the simple syllable settled over the table like soft snow, muffling old anxieties, inviting new possibilities. Invisible servants freshened the candles, yet their flames seemed quieter now, as though acknowledging the fragile truce they eliminated. Belle tasted honeyed tea, and the sweetness clung to her throat, paving the way for calmer speech. The beast, Having ravaged little of his feast, toyed with the filigreed spoon and absurdly delicate implement in his massive paw, while listening to Belle describe the village's spring festival, the flutter of ribbons, the way children chased their own shadows at dusk. Each image, small and bright, gathered like fireflies around the beast's long-intended hopes. When at last the courses dwindled, a hush as gentle as snowfall returned. Invisible hands whisked away plates, napkins folded themselves into silent lilies. A final candle was pinched, leaving only hearth glow to cradle the two unlikely companions. Belle rose. The beast stood a second later, taller than the mantle, yet somehow diminished by shyness. He escorted her toward the sweeping stair, their slow steps echoing in twinned heartbeats. At the landing, where shadow met lamplight, he paused. "Sleep well," he said, the phrase fragile as spun sugar between tusked teeth. Belle inclined her head and answered with the certainty that it helped her survive the day, until tomorrow's dinner. The promise hovered, luminous and whole. The beast returned the mirror to her keeping. Its weight was slight, its comfort vast. Then he retreated down a passageway lined with aging tapestries, his silhouette swallowing torch after torch until only darkness remained. Belle crossed the threshold of a chamber prepared for her, yet before surrendering to rest she set the mirror upon a bedside table. Moonlight, silver and shy, glided through gauzy curtains, touching the glass just enough to suggest her father's outline still working, still humming. The sight settled her heartbeat, and when she finally slipped between sheets scented faintly of lavender and old wood smoke, she carried with her a question less of fear than of wonder. What history had carved such loneliness into the beast, and what balm might conversation provide? The castle, meanwhile, exhaled. Beams creaked the way forests sigh after long rains, and hidden clocks ticked in unison, a hush shaped by time, attended by magic. Somewhere in the depths, unseen musicians rehearsed a chord that might, in another season, bloom into dance. For tonight, however, all movement subsided until even dust motes floated like tiny planets in the dim. Beyond the thick stone walls, branches brushed together in the mild wind, their susurrus neither threat nor summons, but merely part of the larger lullaby enfolding the estate. Stars kindled overhead, slow and certain. Their old light spilled across ramparts, terraces, and frost-touched roses lingering in the courtyard gardens. Thus concluded the first shared meal awkward, earnest, quietly promising in a hall where shadows once ruled unchecked. Tomorrow, in the hush that follows dawn, Belle may begin to explore forgotten libraries and leaf-strewn conservatories, guided by curiosity and the faintest thread of trust. For now the castle and its occupants drift towards sleep, every heartbeat within its walls tuned to the patient cadence of the night. Moonwave stillness lingered in the corridor where the previous tale let its final note fade, that tender echo of a half-remembered melody guiding Belle toward a pair of towering doors veiled in velvet shadow. The quiet hum of enchantment seemed to breathe against the hinges, and when she eased one panel ajar, the vast hush within drifted out like the exhalation of some patient slumbering mind. A single oil lamp hanging from a silver hook greeted her with mellow radiance, coaxing the corridor's lingering moonlight inward, so that the two lights, one earthly, one celestial, could merge and wander ahead of her. She stepped into a chamber so spacious that its furthest corners disappeared in a gentle haze, and yet the scale felt immediately intimate, as though every shelf, every crack in the parquet floor, every kindly scroll and steadfast folio had been waiting solely for her arrival. High above, a crystal skylight cupped the night, and through that glass the stars poured a milk-pale shimmer that floated downward in trembling lances, catching the slow drift of dust motes until they glittered like snowflakes suspended inside a globe. The hush she had sensed at the threshold revealed itself now as a layered silence made of secrets, the silence of turned pages settling back into place, of ink grown soft with years, of stories pausing mid-breath while their readers slept. To left and right, aisles stretched away between mahogany stacks, each shelf crowned with carved roses, whose petals curled toward the ceiling like waves frozen at dusk. Beneath the roses, gilded lettering spelled titles in dozens of forgotten tongues. There were atlases drawn with blush-pinked oceans, epics woven on silk instead of parchment, slim journals bound in cloud-grey vellum, and children's tales whose spines bore the faint thumbprints of generations. In the alcoves near the walls, low chaise longueurs waited under brocade throws, accompanied by modest tables upon which rested pewter teapots and tiny hourglasses, half drained of silvery sand. Belle moved forward, her slippers silent on the marquetry floor, her fingertips drifting along the books as though brushing meadow grass. With every inch, the chamber brightened, not by lantern or candelabrum, but through the shimmering communion of polished wood, burnished brass, and tranquil starlight balancing upon pale pages. She felt something within her unwrinkle some inner map unfolding to admit new coasts and continents. In that unwrinkling gathered a hush deeper than quiet, the hush of belonging. A slender volume bound in midnight blue called to her. She drew it free, and a faint, sun-dried fragrance rose the memory of distant summers pressed between pages. Settling onto a window seat, whose cushion had sagged just enough to cradle her weight, she opened the book at random. Out spilled a poem about orchards breathing out sweetness at first light, its lines so unhurried they seemed to blossom between heartbeats. While she read, the library's silence changed timbre for a moment, as though the walls were listening. From the far end of the aisle came a sound softer than footfall, a measured stirring of velvet and fur. The beast emerged from a curtain of shadow, not imposing now, but almost shy, a russet cloak gathered loosely over broad shoulders. He paused, head bowed, eyes low, as if uncertain whether to intrude upon her reverie. The lamplight painted mellow bronze across his mane, catching a hint of the prince he had once been. For a long breath they shared a stillness made of mutual permission. Then Belle, without speaking, tilted the open volume in invitation. He approached by slow degree, the way a skittish stag might edge toward a forest clearing. Settling opposite her, he sank onto the polished floor and folded his great hands, claws tucked from view. She began to read aloud quietly, almost conversationally, and the poems. Orchard opened around them, rows of apple trees powdered with petals, bees humming low arcs through warm air, and a distant brook offering its thread of song. The library received Belle's voice and echoed it back in softened form, so each word seemed cushioned by velvet, sauntering rather than marching across the ear. Night yielded to dawn. Soft cinnamon light crept through the skylight, and somewhere in the castle a clock struck a mild, amber note. They remained where they were, turning pages together, their shared silence gradually maturing into companionship. When Belle paused over a curious phrase, the beast leaned forward to trace the looping script with one claw tip, suggesting a meaning she had not considered. When the beast stumbled over a rare dialect, Belle offered a translation flavoured with laughter. Thus was their friendship kindled, not by grand gesture, but by the measured exchange of curiosity, the tender bridging of two minds daring to meet halfway, time that elusive caretaker decided then to drift in seasons rather than minutes. Spring sunlight puddled across the reading tables, pooling in golds and greens while the orchard poem found its mirror in real blossoms far beyond the library's walls. The beast, compelled by some inward music, restored a forgotten harpsichord in a corner alcove. Its notes fluttered like larks whenever Belle searched the shelves. Summer followed, and warm wind fingered the casement, fluttering loose pages so that the room became a gentle percussion of parchment wings. They took to reading travelogues filled with desert horizons and moonlit caravans, cooling themselves with descriptions of oasis pools. Autumn drifted in on copper breezes, carrying with it the faint scent of ember and apple. Leaves, having surrendered their greens, strolled past the high windows in swirling murmurs, and every flutter echoed the turning of pages. Belle and the beast read philosophy then, savouring sentences that pondered impermanence, their discussions respectful, meandering, unafraid of silence. When winter's hush arrived, the library cloaked itself in pearl-grey light, and they explored legends of hearth spirits and auroras, letting the tales warm them better than fire. Through this procession of seasons, the harpsichord offered gentle interludes. Sometimes Belle would hum a forgotten lullaby, and the beast, surprised by memory, would follow with a baritone hum so deep it seemed to arise from the marble foundations. Magic mingled with melody. Chandeliers flickered in time, and distant corridors echoed faint refrains, as though the castle itself longed to sing but had misplaced its voice. Yet no sound disturbed the library's tranquility. Every note ended softly, dissolving into the hush that had greeted her on that first midnight. Beyond the last row of shelves lay a modest archway. Belle had scarcely noticed. One afternoon, curiosity led her through it into a vaulted gallery lined with portrait frames of varying size and mood. The floor beneath her feet was strewn with rose-shaped shadows cast by stained glass clerestories overhead, and each step felt like crossing petals scattered for a solemn ceremony. Dust sheets covered many canvases, but the few that remained unveiled caught the slender sunlight and held it, as though each face wished to glow in its own remembrance. The first portrait revealed a slender boy with dark, wandering eyes, dressed in brocade too grand for his narrow shoulders. An inscription, nearly rubbed away, bore a name she recognized from the kingdom's oldest ballads, the beast's childhood title before the curse had folded him into fur and sorrow. A second painting showed that boy older, perhaps 12, standing beside a stern figure whose posture declared power, yet whose eyes flickered with fatigue. In the background hovered a banquet hall strewn with opulence, and a small caged songbird painted in the upper corner suggested a deeper narrative. Belle moved from frame to frame, piecing together a life in fragments, the promise of youth curving into pride, pride bending toward loneliness, loneliness broken open by loss, brushstrokes sharpened across the ears, colours dimmed as if light had become reluctant to linger. In the last uncovered canvas, a young prince stood alone on a balcony beneath a bruised sky, half turned away, surrendering a single red rose to the wind. The painter had caught the exact instant the petals began their useless flight, and the expression on the prince's face mingled regret with dawning humility too late, perhaps to alter his fate. Belle neither pitied nor judged. Instead, she listened inwardly to what the images whispered about fear, about the frailty within all bravado. She thought of the beast kneeling over the orchard poem, careful not to crease its pages, and she understood that gentleness sometimes survives inside the fiercest disguise, waiting for the right hush in which to speak. Empathy unfolded in her like a pale blossom coaxed open by first light, delicate yet undeniably real. That evening, she returned to the library carrying one portrait, a small oval miniature of the prince as a child cradled against her heart. The beast looked up from a volume of astronomy, startled, wary. Belle set the miniature upon the reading table, then opened beside it an anthology of tales about forgiveness. Wordlessly, she slid the book toward him. He regarded the gesture as though it were a rare dialect newly discovered, and when at last he placed his broad hand upon the page, it trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of being understood. Together they read a story of two rivers, born on opposite sides of a day mountain, meeting at last in a jeweled delta where their waters mingled and forgot separation. As Belle spoke the final sentence, the harpsichord, though untouched, uttered a single harmonic that glowed like soft candlelight. Perhaps the castle had found its voice after all, awakened by the note of empathy passing between reader and listener. Neither questioned the small miracle. They only sat in its warmth. Night settled once more beneath the crystal skylight. Candles dwindled to silver puddles. The dust motes of earlier hours now floated like faint constellations released from gravity. Belle closed the anthology, and the quiet that followed felt full rather than empty, as though every story on every shelf recognized itself inside their silence. The beast exhaled a slow, steady release, and for the first time the breath carried no hint of gloom. Something had lifted, invisible yet unmistakable, leaving behind a spaciousness that smelled faintly of orchard blossoms and winter pine all at once. Somewhere beyond the library's walls, the garden's enchanted roses were stirring, their scent seeping along corridors, suggesting that the bond nurtured in words would soon require the courage of acts. But for the present moment, the library of light held them gently, page and portrait, melody and memory, weaving the lingering notes of one day into the quiet seed of the next. Far off, a conservatory door clicked ajar, and a draught carried in the faint rustle of green leaves newly unfurled. In that whisper of foliage lay tomorrow's invitation, a promise of mysteries lingering beneath glass and dew. The story, unhurried, turned a fresh page and rested there, content to wait until the dawn found them once again. Night had drifted softly over the castle, dimming the lingering blush of the previous chapter's hearth-glow into a pearly hush of winter starlight. Within that translucent stillness, Belle rose from her chair beside the library embers, wrapped her cloak of deep indigo about her shoulders, and answered the quiet knock that had summoned her to the front steps. A sleigh waited there, varnished wood gleaming like sap-rich amber beneath the moon. Its runners whispering against the powdery snow. The beast, already seated, extended a furred arm in invitation, and Belle, trusting the gentle timbre of his breathing, stepped aboard without question. 2 dapple-grey steeds stirred at the light touch of a silken rein, and the sleigh began to glide, almost weightless, across the terrace. Hooves pressed delicate crescents into the crusted surface, releasing faint sighs of silver vapor that curled upward before dissolving into the clear air. Frosted hedges, trained into quiet arabesques during autumn, now wore diadems of rime that scattered shards of reflected moonlight. As the pair travelled deeper through the gardens, the castle behind them faded into silhouette, and a gentle hush, composed of muffled bells, wing beats, and distant falling snow, unfolded around their shared breath. The beast handled the reins with unexpected delicacy, guiding the sleigh past frozen rose pools, whose petals entombed in ice resembled thin ghosts of summer melodies. Belle watched the subtle play of lamplight across his profile. The proud sweep of horn, the coarse mane tempered by ears held slightly back in concentration, the warm plume of breath that clouded and cleared against a twilight washed with stars. In that moment she sensed a wordless accord, as though the night itself had chosen them to witness its silent ballet of frost and candle-coloured planetary drift. Midway through the orchard path, one of the steeds tossed its head, whickering in alarm. A darker shape lay strewn across the snow ahead, almost indistinguishable from the tangled shadows of bare branches. Belle signalled for the sleigh to halt. Together they approached and discovered a young wolf, flank matted with fresh crimson, breathing in short, trembling shivers. Ice crystals clung to its fur like unwanted jewels. No menace glimmered in its half-lidded eyes, only bewildered pain and the instinctive plea of a creature caught between life and the long sleep of winter. Without hesitation, the beast knelt, the great weight of his body settling into the snow with the gentleness of a falling feather. Belle lowered herself beside him, pressing a fold of her cloak against the wound while murmuring soft encouragement meant as much for the wolf as for her uncertain hands. The beast slid strong arms beneath the injured animal and lifted it into the sleigh, lining the wooden floor with spare blankets he had tucked away for unforeseen need. In those hushed minutes their earlier reserve dissolved, replaced by a shared, unspoken resolve to guard a vulnerable life. The journey resumed at a gentler pace, the sleigh tracing a new path toward the glass conservatory, where medicinal herbs overwintered in earthen pots. Lamps within glowed like dulled citrine, promising warmth without glare. Belle crushed dried yarrow and thyme between her palms, releasing green fragrance to mingle with the snow-tanged air, while the beast prepared clean bandages torn from a linen napkin. Together they salved, wrapped, and settled the wolf beneath a quilted coverlet. Through it all, the animal remained remarkably still, as though recognizing the fragile treaty bound by kindness and by the moonlight that watched in silence. Hours later, when the bells of the night's clock chimed softly through the corridors, Belle found herself standing at the threshold of the ballroom, summoned by music so quiet it seemed woven from candle fire. Snow sifted through high-arched windows left ajar, each flake drifting like a slow petal from some invisible orchard of clouds. The floor, polished to the sheen of frozen lake water, mirrored the swirl of white fragments. The beast waited at its center, gloved in dusk blue velvet, broad shoulders held in tentative grace. He extended his hand once more, not in command but in hopeful question. Belle placed her fingers in his, warm against the faintly callous pads, and together they began a waltz, measured not by percussion but by the hush of falling snow. Each turn gathered a small eddy of white petals that rose around them, danced, then alighted again upon the glossy floorboards. Lanterns, suspended from invisible threads beneath the vaulted ceiling, swayed with the gentlest sway of air, their flames dipping in small bows like courteous spectators. Conversation was unnecessary. Breath, heartbeat, and the soft creak of silk against velvet supplied a melody more intimate than any orchestral score. When the final chord faded, felt, rather than heard, the beast guided them to the shadowed edge of the chamber. Snow settled in their hair like faint constellations. For a long moment, he seemed content merely to share silence, but slowly his chest rose with emotion too deliberate to be casual. Words emerged, halting at first, as though centuries of solitude had rusted the very hinges of speech. He spoke of nights ruled by echo, of dinners served to empty chairs, of voices remembered only in dreams, until a rough tremor broke the litany, and he admitted the raw core of it: loneliness. Belle listened, her own heart tightening with recognition, for she carried her own quiet ache, the absence of her father, who even now wintered in the village with little knowledge of the marvels and dangers that ringed this enchanted domain. She remembered evenings at his workbench, sawdust floating in lamplight, the gentle rasp of his story shaping her childhood. Those memories glimmered inside her like lanterns glimpsed through frost panes, lovely yet remote. Standing beside the beast's confession, she felt them shift, tugged by a new gravitational field, an affection unexpected in its depth and uncertain in its future form. She did not offer quick comfort. Instead, she raised his heavy hand and pressed it to her cheek, letting the gesture speak of presence rather than promise. The beast's eyes, gold-limned with doubt, softened. Stillness flowed between them like a slow river in thaw, carrying away scraps of old fear. At last, Belle whispered that companionship, like winter roses, might bloom where least foreseen, provided patient care and time. The beast inclined his head, horns casting curved shadows upon the wall, and in the quiet that followed the snow continued to fall, gentle as closing eyelids. Later, in her chamber overlooking the inner courtyard, Belle drifted into uneasy sleep. Dreams carried her first to the cramped cottage she had once called home. She saw her father bent over blueprints by candlelight, rubbing weary eyes, humming an old sea shanty that had charted their shared hopes. Frost edged the window, and beyond it the castle loomed like a mirage, every tower a question. Then the scene tilted, transmuting into the ballroom where the beast waited beneath swirling snow petals. His outstretched hand was the same she had held, yet her father's silhouette stood behind him, remote, unresolved. Conflicted yearning rippled across the dreamscape, neither fully sorrow nor unalloyed joy but a trembling chord of both. In a half-lucid moment before waking, Belle sensed that the castle and the cottage were not opposing poles, but two chambers of the same beating heart, each requiring its own tender vigil. A candle quivered on her bedside table, casting soft aureoles upon the draped walls. Beyond the glass, the moon sank toward dawn, and somewhere in the conservatory the wolf rasped a faint, recovering breath. The night, though cold, had woven fragile threads of connection through every slumbering room. In the first pale hint of morning, a single silver bell rang from the highest turret, announcing the arrival of a messenger who had braved snow-laden roads from the distant village. The sound drifted no further than the courtyard, barely loud enough to disturb the hush, yet its echo laid a slender pathway between Belle's two worlds. While she slept on, the castle readied itself for daylight discussions, for letters opened beside the wolf's resting place, for decisions distilled like slow-falling flakes. And winter, steadfast and crystalline, prepared to yield ever so gradually to the stirring pulse of coming spring. Somewhere beneath the frozen lake beyond the orchard, koi drifted in slow circles, their fins moving like languid fans through water that remembered warmer days. Icicles hanging from the balustrade lengthened imperceptibly, each a hollow flute waiting for the thaw to coax it into song. Servants enchanted into candlesticks and clocks dozed at their posts, their flames and pendulums keeping time with the patience only enchantment bestows. All through the sweeping corridors echoed the subdued certainty that change would arrive quietly, as snowmelt rather than avalanche, as sunrise rather than flare. For now, the castle dreamed alongside its guests, content within winter's crystalline cradle. And in that quiet cradle, faint heartbeats of hope pulsed, steady as the distant sea, awaiting the soft swell of tomorrow gracefully. Snowlight still glimmered upon the velvet drifts outside the castle when the new dawn slipped in, gentle as a sigh, and found Belle resting in a chair beside the great hearth. The final image of the previous eve, the beast retreating through lamplit arches while the enchanted musicians played a hymn of wordless gratitude, hung in her memory like a lantern glinting through mist. She had fallen asleep thinking of his unexpected kindness, dreaming of forgotten gardens and of roses that never faded. Yet with morning came an unease, hushed but persistent, curling around her thoughts like winter smoke. The enchanted mirror, gift of the castle's unseen magic, shimmered upon the low table, inviting curiosity. Belle lifted the ornate frame, its metal warm despite the chill, and whispered the one name closest to her heart. At once the glass cleared, and the familiar cottage appeared roof-frosted, door ajar, smoke rising thinly into a colourless sky. Her father sat within, head bowed, hands trembling around a cup he seemed too weak to raise. In the corner, where laughter once lingered, a single candle guttered, haloed by drifting dust. There was no one else. A pang pierced the quiet spell of the castle. Chill fingers of worry traced Belle's spine, nudging her to move, to speak, to rescue. She set the mirror aside and hurried through corridors where golden sconces still glowed with dreamlike light. Somewhere in the western wing the beast was pacing, and she found him by the winter garden's glass doors, silent beneath a vault of frozen vines. The gentle radiance of the flowers that bloomed year-round illuminated his shadowed profile. Misgiving, too, had disturbed his night. Belle's plea unfolded, not in urgent cries but in a tremulous cadence, like a brook seeking a broader stream. She told him of the mirror's vision, of her father's pallor, of her longing to be, for a little while, a daughter once more. The beast listened with the same stillness the statues kept, though a tremor was it fear, or sorrow of Duruv, shook the curl of his mane. When at last he spoke, his voice was almost human in its fragility. Then, he murmured, "For love is stronger than any wall I might raise, but return within a week. 7 nights, no more. The rose depends upon it, and so do we." He drew from beneath his cloak the delicate blossom that had been blooming on her bedside shelf, a rose of impossible scarlet, cupped by petals that shimmered as though dusted with dawn. The bloom slept within a crystal globe that held away every frost. "Take this," he said, placing the treasure in her hands as carefully as one would cradle a bird's egg. "As long as it thrives, hope thrives. Each petal lost is an hour undone." No carriage wheels clattered across the drawbridge. No fanfare broke the hush. The kingdom of enchantment preferred its tenderness unannounced. Thus Belle departed on the pale back of the castle's quietest palfrey, cloak drawn tight, rose cradled close, and the echo of the beast's parting words vibrating through the morning hush. Snow softened hoofbeats, fir boughs swept low in languid bows, and somewhere deep among untouched trees, a lone thrush folded its song for winter. By dusk the familiar fields unfolded beyond the frost-silvered orchard. Candlelight flickered through the cottage window panes, but the glow seemed frailer than she remembered. Belle slipped inside, warmth from the hearth embracing her like an old melody. Her father, startled by the snow dust in her hair, yet too weak to rise, reached out with both sensation and disbelief, twined in his gaze. Tender reunion flowed without words, a cool cloth against his brow, broth lifted to patient lips, hands pressed together until their pulses found a common, steady rhythm. When he finally slept, Belle placed the crystal-clad rose on the mantel, where it shone like an ember against night's descent. Soon, however, the cottage stirred with voices sharper than wind across ice. Flora and Leela, her elder sisters, arrived. On a tide of curiosity, their eyes combed Belle's cloak of starlit velvet, measured the sheen of her gloves, judged the modest but rich sparkle of the comb that held her hair. Surprise soured into envy, envy hardened into incredulity, and incredulity birthed suspicion. They questioned her gently at first, then not so gently about the owner of the unseen castle, about the fashion of its feasts, about the purpose of the rose enclosed in crystal. Belle answered in soft, spare phrases, guarding more than the castle's secrets. She also guarded the beast's dignity and the fragile peace that had taken root between them. Morning dwindled into a pale afternoon, and the enchanted rose surrendered its first petal. It drifted within the globe like a slow snowfall, brushed the glass base, and lay still, a scarlet sigh upon crystal. Belle felt time loosen, thread by ruby thread. Her father's strength waxed, colour returned to his cheeks like sunrise to a faded tapestry, yet the rose's colour waned by barely visible degrees. Each dawn she woke to find another petal tremoring, as though the bloom itself dreamt fitful dreams. Word of Belle's mysterious return carried on gossip's nimble wings into every parlour and stable. Villagers leaned over fences, speculating about untold riches, about spells and bargains. Some imagined a prince, others a spectre. The miller's wife whispered that Belle had been spirited away by fairies. The innkeeper swore he had seen her pass beneath the bare birch branches attended by invisible footmen. In curious hearts wonder curdled into worry, and worry, as it often does, sought refuge in blame. Within the cottage, Belle's sisters plotted. If their father had regained warmth and appetite under Belle's gentle nursing, surely she could linger longer. Flora feigned sudden affection and invited neighbours to visit, each caller delaying Belle with fresh conversation and a plea for stories. Lila orchestrated subtle misplacements. Belle's gloves vanished, her travelling cloak restitched with a needle much too small for haste, her modest satchel hidden among filled laundry baskets. They laid snares of small inconveniences, each thread designed to break the fragile calendar of her promise, all the while offering smiles that never touched their eyes. The third night arrived with a hush so deep, even the owls withheld their questions. Yet 2 more petals fluttered down. Belle watched them curl at the base of the globe, petals now 5 in number, and understood that her borrowed hours were dwindling. In her heart, the beast's words murmured like a distant tide. 7 nights. No more. She pictured him alone in the echoing halls, pacing perhaps beside the west wing fireplace, eyes shifting toward the moonlit windows, waiting for a footfall that did not come. Regret pooled inside her like shadow in a well. On the 5th day, the village clergyman paid a visit to offer blessings for her father's recovery. He spoke, too, of fresh fears. Children whispered of a shape moving beyond the tree line at twilight, great and stooped and crowned with horns. Belle, remembering the beast's nightly walks through the orchard of enchantment, held her breath. She realized that love had woven itself through her concern, quiet but inexorable, like ivy cloaking ruin. She could not bear the thought of him misjudged by a world that weighed worth upon appearances alone. And still she had promised to return, had promised him and herself, and perhaps something greater still. The 6th morning bloomed tender and tremulous. One half of the rose already lay strewn beneath its crystalline sky, petals fragile as dried tears. Belle smoothed her father's blankets and found him breathing evenly, strength restored almost to the vigor of his younger days. He smiled and told her she looked older, not in years, but in understanding. When she spoke of her approaching departure, his eyes dimmed only for a moment before he nodded. Having glimpsed the clarity of devotion that shimmered like dawn in her gaze, he pressed into her hands a tiny compass that had once guided him across seas and mountain passes. May it always point you home, whichever home your heart chooses, he whispered. That same evening, clouds massed in indigo layers above the hills. Belle repaired her cloak, found her gloves where Lila had tucked them behind the spice jars, and wrapped the rose in a silken scarf. Sisters objected in plaintive tones. Their hearts, they claimed, would break anew if she left so soon. Yet beneath the tremulous veneers, satisfaction lurked. They believed the storm threatening outside would delay her beyond the week's end, and with every hour she overstayed, the enchantment, whatever it was, might unravel in their favor. But sunrise did arrive, pale and rain-washed, tipping the 7th day into motion. Before the final pearl-grey stars disappeared, Belle kissed her father's brow and stepped into an air thick with promise and farewell mingled. Behind her, the cottage door closed with a sigh. Ahead, the track to the forest lay pooled in wet moonlight. Though wind worried at her cloak and whispered of incoming thunder, her resolve held steady. Within the crystal globe, a single petal still clung to the calyx, trembling like a fragile heartbeat on the verge of silence. Past hedgerows and frost-glazed willows she rode, compass secure at her breast, thoughts strewn across castle corridors she had come to know as kindly guardians of dreams. Somewhere far off, the beast might be keeping vigil by the rose's twin, counting moments as one would count fading embers. Belle urged the palfrey on, though never so fast as to startle the silence, and the animal seemed to sense the urgency wrapped in gentleness. At the forest's edge, dusk's lavender veil began its descent, and Belle paused beneath a towering oak whose branches entwined like cathedral rafters. She touched the crystal globe. The last petal still shimmered, though its color had dimmed to the hue of evening clouds after rain. Wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the distant low rumble of thunder, or, perhaps, of a lonely roar. She could not be certain, yet certainty is not always required for hope to endure. As Belle resumed her journey, clouds parted just enough to reveal a spill of opaline sky. The space between cottage and castle narrowed with each measured hoofbeat, and the promise she had once given spoken in a chamber infused with candle-scented shadows glowed ahead, guiding her as surely as the compass's steady needle. Night gathered, thick, but not unkind, and the path behind Belle faded into memory's gentle hush. Not far ahead, though still hidden by folds of forest, stood a castle of living chandeliers and watchful clocks, of sorrowful secrets and softening hearts. Within its western tower, a lonely figure might already be listening for distant hoofbeats, unaware that forgiveness rode with the storm, braided into wind and rain. Soon the final chapter of the promise would be written, not in ink, but in choices and courage. For now, the evening air brimmed with hush, with the fragrance of damp earth and the quiet knowledge that every journey, even one taken twice, arrives at a different destination within the traveller. And somewhere, deep among the murmuring pines, the castle lamps flickered to life, ready to welcome the echo of Belle's returning footsteps. Moonlight still lingered on Belle's lashes, silver as frost, when the quiet picture that had closed previous chapter faded from the underside of her thoughts. The enchanted mirror, held to her heart the night before, had shown the beast alone by a dying fire, his sorrow curling like smoke along the vaulted ceiling. That image did not vanish with sleep. It pulsed softly in the small hours, a distant heartbeat carried on winter wind. From her narrow cottage room she heard no voices, yet she felt a summons, gentle but insistent, passing through window panes and timber walls, the way dawn slips through shutters. She rose without the usual creak of hesitation, moving as one moves inside a dream, weightless, guided, sure. A single taper lit her path. Its flame wavered yet did not falter, even when she opened the door to the chill outside. She wrapped a woolen shawl over her nightdress, tucked the rose he had once gifted into its folds, and crossed the sleeping yard. Stars faded. The horizon, pale as unspun silk, promised morning but had not yet delivered it. In the stable, Philippe lifted his head, dark eyes full of wordless understanding. Leather settled, stirrup found foot, and they slipped from the village unseen. The road was mud-soft and cool, bordered by hedges whose twigs wore pearl-bright beads of dew. Belle urged no speed, yet the horse quickened, moved by her urgent stillness. Behind them cottages shrank to charcoal outlines. Ahead clouds gathered, bruised and solemn. When thunder spoke distant, low, reluctant, it was more reminder than threat. Raindrops arrived like cautious scouts, settling first on Belle's cheeks, then on the mane beneath her hands. Every sense trained forward, drawn by an invisible filament. She did not name the feeling love, not yet, but the name hovered, gentle and sure, just beyond the curtain of breath. The forest accepted them with a hush that belonged to cathedral aisles. Wet leaves gleamed. Pine needles released a scent both sharp and soothing. Lightning stitched, pale seams, high in the clouds, illuminating the path in flickering lacework. Once she had feared these woods, their snarling wolves and snarling worries. But tonight branches bent in silent benediction, and roots hid themselves beneath rich loam so the horse might pass in safety. Rain thickened, drumming on cloak and bark, yet Belle felt no chill. Memory and hope warmed her, two flames twining in the shelter of her ribs. As miles unspooled, recollections flared, the beast shyly tasting soup, holding the spoon like an untried instrument, his wonder in the library, seeing her joy become his own, the slow, uncertain laughter that had surprised them both beside the hearth. Each memory fluttered around her like a rosy petal cracked free from time. She realized that while she had left the castle to keep a promise to her father, her heart had remained, reading in lamplight, walking snow-laden gardens, listening for the soft tread of paws in adjacent halls. Absence had named the feeling more clearly than presence ever could. Trees thinned, turrets surfaced from the whitening mist, stern yet expectant. The drawbridge lay lowered over a moat, swollen with rain. Gargoyles, glistening wet, looked less menacing, more like weary sentinels, waiting for dawn. Belle dismounted, pressed her cheek to Philippe's warm neck in gratitude, and allowed him to find shelter beneath a sagging eave. Her boots met the stones with a sound like quiet bells. Torches that once leapt to life remained unlit. The castle breathed frost. Corridors echoed only with the whisper of distant water. Still, every shutter and hinge seemed to lean toward her entrance, hoping. She walked through the breadth of the grand hall where chandeliers hung dark, but opalescent, catching stray sparks of stormlight. Tapestries billowed, heavy with untold stories. Dust swirled in the shape of vanished dancers. The hush was enormous yet not empty. It felt like the moment before orchestra strings are drawn, when a whole future rests on the rise of a single baton. Guided by that expectancy, Belle climbed the westward stair to the chamber that held the rose. No candle was needed. The bloom's own glow seeped through hinge gaps and keyholes, painting the corridor in tender crimson. The bell jar's lid sat crooked, as though lifted by a trembling hand then forgotten. Within, the rose shimmered with evening hues against the wan dawn, its stem arching like a question. Only 2 petals clung. The larger sagged, colourless as breath on glass. The smaller still blushed, but its edges quivered with each heartbeat of the room. Tiny red motes spiraled upward, dissolving before they reached the lip of crystal. Belle's fingers hovered above the pedestal, sensing the fragile heat that lived there. Time, kind companion to many tales, was nearly out of stories for this one. A soft intuition half-whisper, half-pulse turned her from the chamber before she fully knew why. Down a slender stair, past empty armour, along an arcade that smelled of damp ivy, She reached the courtyard. Rain had dwindled to silver mist. Puddles mirrored broken arches and the first ghost of sunrise. There, among scattered petals that drifted from some upper window, lay the beast. His broad chest rose shallowly. Fur clung dark and heavy to his frame. The fierce outline she once feared was now simply a silhouette of fatigue. Belle crossed the stones without noise and knelt. She brushed soaked curls from his brow. Under closed lids, his eyes moved, as though dreaming of forgotten fields. When he managed to look at her, recognition surfaced like dawn over distant hills, slow, certain, beautiful. He tried to speak, but the voice would not rise. Belle placed her hand over his heart. The beat beneath it was fragile, yet stubborn. Rainwater pooled around her knees, but she felt only the heat of that faltering rhythm. Words gathered inside her, glistening as beads on a string, and at last she let them fall, soft and steady, into the hush between them. She spoke of shared evenings before the fire, of exploration through forbidden corridors that had ended in laughter, of the kindness he had shown when no one was watching, that truest kindness of all. She admitted that each mile away had felt elongated, like a dream one cannot wake from, and that the mirror's vision of his sorrow had broken something open in her, revealing the room where love had already been living for some time. The beast listened, breathing each syllable as though it might become air in his lungs. Beneath her palm the timid heartbeat steadied, one measure longer. High above, the final petal loosened. A draught poured through cracked shutters, not cold but expectant, and lifted the fragment into the air. It drifted along corridors, over unmanned balconies, through the shattered oculus, gathering the faint glow of dawn as it went. Belle's confession reached its simple climax. She loved him, wholly, without condition or fear. At the instant the petal floated between them, it settled upon the broad hand that lay on the flagstones. Light flared, not bright but deep. The colour of embers seen through closed eyelids, and then the petal faded to pale lace. Silence deepened further, as though the world had slipped under water. Raindrops hung suspended. Wind paused among the treetops. In that pause Belle lowered her forehead to his, tears mingling with the last rain on his face. Her heart felt both breaking and whole, the paradox of love, accepted at the edge of loss. Somewhere inside the hush, she thought she heard a hinge lift, a lock release, a single note ring from a faraway bell. She did not move, trusting the moment to complete itself, without any guidance from mortal hands. Then changes, slow and secret, began to ripple through stone and shadow. Fountains that had been mute sighed into life. Vines released crumbling mortar and straightened with quiet pride. Carved faces on balustrades softened their grimaces. Yet Belle noticed little beyond the warmth that now spread under her palm, a warmth growing steadier, stronger. The beast's outline, still stooped by exhaustion, seemed less heavy. Their transformation had not yet reached unveiling, its promise breathed in every corner. Overhead, clouds parted enough to show a shy slice of blue. A single bird, surprised by its own courage, chirped somewhere high. Light touched the courtyard, faint as a fingertip on a page, preparing the story for its final lines. Servants in distant rooms, candlesticks, clocks, cups, still half dreaming of humanity, stirred, and waited, sensing that the long winter of enchantment was warming at last. Belle, unaware of watchers, repeated her promise, letting the word love drift over them both like a veil of first snow. The echo settled into the flagstones, into the beating heart beneath her hand, into the shy morning sky. What followed, gentle and profound, belonged to the next unfolding of dawn, waiting quietly for the tale's final chapter. Soft charcoal stillness lingered where the last chapter left us, the hush before sunrise when the world waits upon a single breath. Belle knelt beside the fallen beast in the frost-silvered courtyard, her tears darkening the velvet fur, her whispered confession of love drifting upward like candle smoke that refuses to be quenched. Day. The ruined rose lay between them, every petal spent, yet in that stark bareness an invisible seed quickened, and the hush deepened into a pregnant quiet, as though even time leaned closer to listen. To the east, the first feather of light parted the horizon. No fanfare, no trumpet of dawn, only the shy pallor of pearl spreading across low clouds. As the pale beam brushed the courtyard stones, it touched the beast's battered form, and something ancient stirred, the deep magic bound up with kindness freely given, with promises kept though no eye demanded witness. A low tremor moved through claws and lifted mane. Then fur receded like gentle tide from shore, talons softened, great shoulders loosened from their cage of curse. Belle, half dreaming, thought she heard distant chimes, though perhaps it was merely her own heartbeat answering the rising light. Bone reshaped itself in slow spirals. Muscle rewove, the monstrous mask dissolved. At last a young man lay where the creature had fallen tall, unscarred, yet breathing with the unsteady wonder of someone waking twice in one lifetime. Sunlight brushed his brow, and auburn hair caught its glimmer. Belle lifted her eyes and met his. They were the very same eyes she had come to trust in fur-shadowed corridors, gold-flecked, searching, vulnerable, and wise. Recognition flowed between them like quiet water, no need for startled words. The spell had broken upon its own acknowledgement that love had never needed a perfect form, only a willing heart. Far overhead, the castle's stained-glass windows answered the dawn with radiant laughter of colour. Turrets shook off ivy that had crept into every seam during years of sorrow. Shingles straightened, buttresses brightened, and the smallest gargoyle yawned itself back into uncarved stone. Through halls and kitchens, guest rooms and gardens, an invisible bell tolled release. Enchanted candelabra flickered, shrank, and in their stead stood men and women rubbing their hands as though surprised to feel 10 finite fingers again, porcelain teacups, stretched into smiling housekeepers, footstools, elongated into shaggy hounds now barking their delight. The old majordomo, who had spent a decade folded into the tight spine of a clock, cleared his throat, marvelled at the unwrinkled timbre of his own voice, and bowed to everyone he met. Together they drifted into the courtyard, uncertain on freshly human feet, and beheld their prince alive. A single hush, full of gratitude too wide for speech, settled over the gathering. Then, as though the same chord resolved in every spirit at once, applause rose soft at first, then bright, then joyous, echoing off towers and setting doves to flight. Rose petals, now restored in perfumed abundance to every bush, lost no time in riding the air like confetti. The prince reached for Belle's hand, and the castle staff friends, guardians, companions through odd ordeals circled them in gentle festivity. Morning lengthened, yet no one hurried. Tables appeared beneath open arches, dressed in linen that rippled like rainfall. Kettles sang, pastries breathed out honeyed warmth, and laughter meandered through gardens where frost had turned to dew. Belle walked the pathways arm in arm with her prince, pausing to greet each once enchanted soul. She discovered the candlestick's daring flame belonged to a court poet with a flair for jokes. The worried feather duster revealed herself as the head seamstress, still fluttering about everyone's collars, and the stern wardrobe unfolded into an amiable opera singer now practicing scales to test lungs long silent. When noon approached, Belle remembered her father and sisters, the merchant with greying beard and gentle eyes, the 2 women whose temperaments had softened during her absence like pears ripening on a warm sill. She had left them with promises she could not guarantee. Now she wished them the balm of certainty. The prince ordered a carriage trimmed with swan feathers, sturdy yet swift, and invited Belle to guide him first to the humble cottage that had sheltered their earliest hopes. The road wound from alpine crags through quiet glens where sheep grazed on thyme-scented hillsides. Villagers paused at fences as the gleaming carriage rolled past, whispering at sight of Belle in travel cloak beside an unfamiliar noble who wore no crown, only an open smile. By twilight the travellers reached the merchant's garden, fragrant with late roses Belle's own hands had pruned seasons earlier. Lantern light gilded the doorway. Her father emerged, perhaps answering some instinct older than memory. At first his knees weakened, but joy steadied him, and he drew Belle close with all the strength sorrow had failed to steal. The prince bowed, introduced himself not as ruler, but as the one indebted to her courage. Inside, firelight painted every face with copper glow. The sisters, once preoccupied with ribbons and rivalry, hurried to brew mulled cider, fussing over Belle's comfort before she could lift a kettle. Across simple oak planks they shared stories of enchanted menus that courted guests, of library ladders that rolled like whispers, of ballroom ceilings filled with midnight constellations. The sisters listened wide-eyed, though no envy stirred, for they sensed the greater treasure lay, not in marvels but in the change kindness had carved within them all. Before the prince departed that night, he placed a scroll upon the merchant's table, stamped in violet wax with the new royal seal, a single open rose. It conveyed deed to warehouses once confiscated by creditors, the clearing of all debts, and a stipend whose modesty disguised its true value, the freedom to choose work without despair. The merchant's eyes shimmered, words tangled at his lips, but gratitude found its ease in silence. He clasped the prince's shoulder like a father blessing a son, and the glow of the hearth felt. It's really as wide as any throne room. In days that followed, invitations fluttered across the realm. Farmers received gilded letters asking them to feast at the reopened castle, while scholars were summoned to help catalogue a library long asleep under dust. The once chanted staff travelled the countryside on errands of goodwill, eager to greet the world with their renewed humanity. They carried no pomp, only stories and loaves of sweet bread, still warm from palace ovens. Winter seeded to spring in slow fragrances. First snowdrop, then crocus, then the bold fanfare of narcissus along riverbanks. On one such mild afternoon, Belle and the prince returned to the rose garden where everything had begun and ended and begun again. Trowels in hand, they planted a new bush at the courtyard centre, a simple white variety, whose petals blushed faintly at the edges, as though remembering the crimson lineage before choosing its own shade. They spoke little, letting the rhythmic crumble of soil complete sentences thoughts had never started, and when they finished, they watched bees explore the early buds, each golden body buzzing a benediction over the fresh root. The prince asked, almost shyly, whether Belle would remain as mistress of the castle's vast corridors and of his newly unburdened heart. Belle answered not with rushing words, but by slipping her garden-dampened fingers through his, their joined hands lightly traced by earth, promise, and dew. Celebration followed in gentle waves music, threading through moonlit halls, children from nearby farms, twirling beneath chandeliers they had only glimpsed from distant hilltops, and elders nodding to one another at the miracle of a kingdom restored without sword or siege, but by patience and clear-sighted love. Seasons rounded again, each bearing quiet rewards rather than thunderous triumphs. The staff found themselves listening for birdsong in places where once they'd strained for ticking gears. The opera singer offered free lessons to any villager who wished to find the hidden bell inside a breath. The poet composed verses on candleglow and the exact sweetness of peaches after rain. These he pinned to market stalls so anyone might carry home a fleck of beauty folded in bread wrappers. One late summer evening, Belle sat beside the prince on a balcony, whose balustrade warmed under fading sun. Below, linden trees shimmered, their leaves whispering a lullaby older than any castle. Belle recalled how she had first judged the beast's form, how fear had almost closed the door to every gentle hour that followed. She wondered aloud whether the world might learn, some day, to greet strangeness with curiosity rather than dread. The prince listened, then spoke the simplest vow that their governance would tilt toward mercy, that taxes would neither wound nor humiliate, that the measure of greatness would be the shelter afforded the least visible neighbor. Years stretched softly forward, their pages turning as seamlessly as silk sliding across a loom. And now, as we approach the closing words of this chronicle, the castle stands in tranquil dusk once more, its lanterns glowing like thoughtful fireflies along the ramparts. Somewhere a librarian clasps a new shipment of blank journals, eager for fresh stories. Somewhere farther down an untravelled lane, an aged woodcutter hums because a loaf of palace bread tasted of remembered youth. Their peace, delicate yet durable, is the echo of a single truth discovered in a snow-laden forest and reaffirmed beneath blooming arches. But what is essential is always perceived first by the quiet heart and only afterward recognized by the wondering eye. Listener, gentle traveller who has walked these 10 chapters beside Belle and her companions, time has come to close the painted cover of this tale. May its final scene rest within you, like the hush after snowfall, inviting dreams where every harsh outline softens and every shadow proves itself companion to light. When dawn next opens your own window, may you greet what you see with the same tender courage that turned a beast into a friend, a castle into a home, and an ordinary day into the first page of something beautiful. For now, the storybook's pages settle together, a hush of paper against paper, and the golden script upon its spine fades into the dimness of a night's lamp gently lowered. The last petal, once a herald of despair, now glows intact upon its stem under the rising moon, a quiet reminder that love, when trusted, rewrites every ending. Let that assurance drift with you into slumber, where roses never wilt and dawn is forever kind.